In addition to recording the stimulus information, the therapist also records the type of response the child makes. Data on the type of response is recorded in the two columns labeled Trial Data. The first column is used for recording the type of response following trials of the first target. The second column is used for recording the type of response following distractor trials or trials of a second target. As you can see, each column contains an abbreviation for each of the 4 types of responses: correct, incorrect, no response, and prompted. Let's take a closer look at how each of these types of responses is recorded. When a child responds with the expected response for a given SD, the response is considered correct and the C is circled. For example, on the first trial, Alice presented the SD, "Do this," and clapped her hands. In response, Johnny clapped his hands. Since clap is the first target and Johnny's response was correct, Alice circled C for correct response in the column labeled T1. When a child responds with any response other than the expected response, it is considered incorrect and the I is circled. Additionally, for each incorrect response, the therapist must write a description of the child's actual response in the column labeled Actual Response. For example, in the second trial, Alice presented the SD, "Do this," and knocked on the table. In response, Johnny clapped his hands. Since imitating knocking is a previously mastered target and the response was incorrect, Alice circled I for incorrect response in the distractor column and recorded clap in the actual response column. When a child does not react at all in response to the SD, it is considered no response and the NR is circled on the data sheet. For example, on the third trial, Alice presented the SD, "Do this," and knocked on the table, and Johnny didn't react at all. So Alice circled NR for no response in the column labeled for distractor trials. Lastly, when a therapist presents a prompt in addition to the SD, the child's response is considered prompted and the P is circled. Additionally, a description of the prompt is recorded in the column labeled Prompt Used. For example, on the fourth trial, Alice presented the SD, "Do this," knocked on the table with her left hand, and with her right hand gently guided Johnny's hand toward the table. Alice circled P for prompted response in the distractor column, and then recorded the prompt she used, a partial physical prompt, to increase the probability of a correct response from Johnny. The comment section of the discrete trial data sheet is used to record any additional information that may be important, such as the type of distractors used, effective prompting techniques, inappropriate behaviors observed during the lesson, or instructions to other therapists regarding which step of the discrimination training procedure to use in the next session. For example, Alice noticed that between trials of this lesson, Johnny had a tendency to inappropriately wave his fingers in front of his eyes. So she wrote a comment to the other therapists so they could be prepared to address the behavior. Finally, this raw data is summarized as percent correct. The percent correct is calculated in 3 ways: Target 1 responses, distractors or Target 2 responses, and overall responses. We'll begin with Target 1 responses. Calculating the percent correct for Target 1 responses provides the program supervisor with a summary measure of how often the child responds correctly to Target 1. It does not include any information from distractor or Target 2 responses. Percent correct for Target 1 is calculated by dividing the total number of correct responses for Target 1 by the total number of trials presented for Target 1 and multiplying that figure by 100%. Looking at the example with Johnny, there were 4 trials of Target 1. Of the 4, he had 2 correct responses, 1 incorrect, and 1 prompted. So Alice calculated the percent correct by dividing the number of correct responses, 2, by the total number of responses made, 4, and multiplied that number by 100% for a total of 50% correct. She then recorded 50% in the Target 1 percentage box. Now let's look at the percent correct for the distractor trials, or Target 2 responses. Calculating the percent correct for these trials provides the program supervisor with a summary measure of how often the child responds correctly during these trials. It does not include any information from the Target 1 trials. Percent correct for Target 2 or distractor trials is calculated by dividing the total number of correct responses for these trials by the total number of these trials that were presented, and multiplying that figure by 100%. In the example with Johnny, there were a total of 6 distractor trials. Johnny responded correctly on 3 and incorrectly on 1 trial. He didn't respond on 1 trial and was prompted on 1. So Alice calculated the percent correct by dividing the number of correct responses, 3, by the total number of responses made, 6, and multiplied that number by 100% for a total of 50% correct.